Our first speaker this evening is Professor Tracey McNamara from the Western University in California, where she is Professor of Veterinary Pathology. Professor McNamara specializes in the recognition and understanding of diseases of captive and free-ranging wildlife and is best work for her work on West Nile virus. Indeed, her work on West Nile virus led her to giving a TEDx talk entitled Canaries in the Coal Mine about continued gaps in biosurveillance for emerging biological threats. And to be honest, that's where we were first introduced to her work. She played a leading role in the discovery of West Nile virus in the US in 1999. She has served as a consultant to the National Biosurveillance Advisory Subcommittee and continues to be actively involved in the development of the nation's biosurveillance strategy. She is actively involved in the One Health movement and advocates for a species-neutral approach to detection of pandemic threats. She is a Salzburg Fellow. Most recently, she was asked to be a member of the Red Dawn break-in team on COVID-19, a group of experts advising the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response of the United States. That's Professor McNamara's professional resume, but I'm sure you're all asking, with a name like McNamara, she must have some Irish roots, and she most definitely has. Tracey's people come from the village of Dromahane in County Clare on the west coast. So we were delighted to welcome one of our own, so to speak, to give the first presentation of this evening. So over to you, Tracey.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes, we can, yes.
Okay. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for the invitation. So I'm going to be talking about, as we said, One Health, and that's the theme for tonight's meeting, this week's meeting. So what is One Health, and why are we so desperately in need of adopting this approach? In 1999, I was involved. My screen is not advancing. Okay.
If you just click into the screen, click on with the mouse. You should have the arrows down the bottom left then.
I got it. Okay. So what is One Health? And we already heard, really, it's the recognition of the interrelatedness of human, animal, and environmental health. And what we're looking for are these areas where there is overlap between these different sectors. And in 1999, I was involved in the recognition of a virus that had never before been seen in the Western Hemisphere, West Nile virus. And it truly was a wake-up call for the United States, because it showed us how utterly unprepared we were to deal with a disease that crossed species lines. Unfortunately, our system in the United States has these entrenched silos, and it was very difficult getting the public health agency and the veterinary agencies to work together. And as we were just told, the so-called lessons for public health preparedness was to expect the unexpected. Unfortunately, I think we all need some remedial education, because clearly those lessons have not been learned. West Nile virus served as a launch pad for the One Health movement. And since that time, we have had many more wake-up calls, including SARS, Nipah, Hendra, H1N1, the Middle Eastern respiratory virus found in camels, monkeypox, and the hits just keep on coming. And all of these recent emerging infectious zoonotic diseases, meaning these are diseases that cross between animals to humans, have actually been zoonotic. So we are left with the question, are we any better prepared to deal with novel diseases that cross species barriers today than we were in 1999? Basically, who is in charge of zoonoses? We are still answering that question. 21 years after West Nile virus. And why do we have that problem? Well, personally, having attempted to address these issues for more than 2 decades, I think it's because public health is in charge, and they don't see One Health, they see our health, meaning the entire focus is on humans, without taking into account that we really need to be looking across that Venn diagram. But we really don't have a Venn diagram. What we have, at least in the US, are 3 distinct circles. And unfortunately, these reflect the funding for the different components of the Venn diagram, and the biggest one being human health. Then the smaller one being agriculture, and really a tiny, tiny circle for wildlife, and nothing at all for all those other species that fall outside of the jurisdiction of any federal agency and are therefore not under any form of surveillance. So really, when we look at our ability to detect emerging zoonotic threats, the way we operate is the flip-flop. It's the exact opposite of a One Health approach. And we are teetering on this precipice because we are not putting funding into those animals that have been related to recent pandemic threats. So our situation is is precarious indeed. And does it matter? Well, I guess as a taxpayer, my take in it is, unless we do address this myopic approach, we will never find emerging pandemic threats until we have people in emergency rooms or bodies in the morgue. We are going to serve as the canaries in the coal mine. So in 1999, I was head of pathology at the Bronx Zoo, and I was working really in a frontier of veterinary medicine. People may not realize, but in a country as large as the United States, only 7 zoos have full-time veterinary pathologists on staff. And because of that, I was working really in a frontier of veterinary medicine. We knew very little about the diseases of captive endangered wildlife. And because they're kept in herds and flocks, and because of their value as endangered species, we always had to be on alert for any kind of disease introduction into our captive collections. And because it was a frontier, certainly I had to rule out all the known diseases that had ever been described in horses or chickens or pigs. But I had to, at the end of every necropsy, ask myself a simple question. What if this is something new? I made no assumptions. I kept an open mind. And from that came discovery. And as Louis Pasteur said, fortune favors the prepared mind. So in early June, large numbers of crows were seen dying in New York City. This was seen. This was reported by the public, and they were clamoring for a diagnosis. But think of that inverted pyramid where basically we have almost no funding for the wildlife sector. There was no veterinary pathologist involved in early diagnosis of these crows. It was a wildlife biologist with no formal training in pathology who announced that the birds were dying of pesticide exposure. Fast forward to mid-August, and those same crows started dropping onto the grounds of the Bronx Zoo, where they represented a possible threat to our captive collection. So I launched into an investigation, and what I found at necropsy and on histopathology was clear indication of a viral encephalitis. This had nothing to do with pesticide exposure. This was a viral infection, and I needed to track it down and figure out what it was. Now, as a veterinarian, working in the United States, I knew that there were only 3 viruses reported to cause encephalitis in birds in North America. The first one is exotic Newcastle's disease. The second one was highly pathogenic avian influenza. And the third one was a mosquito-borne disease, Eastern equine encephalitis. But working in a zoo, I had a unique advantage, and that was we had a petting zoo with chickens. Now, had it been either Newcastle's or avian influenza, the chickens should have been dropping dead, but they weren't. Plus, the pathology was way too different from what I'd seen in an experiment in the infected birds with either one of those diseases. So I was like, well, that kind of knocks them out of consideration. The third one to consider would have been the mosquito-borne virus, Eastern equine encephalitis. However, as luck would have it, the Bronx Zoo happened to have a flock of emus, the Australian ostriches. And I knew, because I read the veterinary literature, that emus are exquisitely sensitive for Eastern equine encephalitis. It kills them. And just as the chickens would have served as sentinels for either of the known poultry diseases, the emus, in not dying, helped me rule out the differential diagnosis of Eastern equine encephalitis. And with that, I was left with, well, I don't know what's going on here. This looks like something new. This coincided with the New York City Department of Health announcing that people were dying of an unusual form of encephalitis, St. Louis encephalitis. And I couldn't help but think, encephalitic people, encephalitic birds, same time, same place. Could there possibly be a link? And I immediately placed a call to the USDA and told them, I know you need to rule out Newcastle's flu, Eastern equine, but I'm telling you, this is something new. And if I'm wrong, I will eat my veterinary license. I begged them to put my tissues on cell culture the moment they arrived. I said, we have to isolate this virus and do electron microscopy. If indeed the viral particles are 40 nanometer diameter, that makes them a flavivirus, like the CDC diagnosis of St. Louis encephalitis. The problem is St. Louis encephalitis does not kill birds. Either this was a new form of St. Louis or it wasn't St. Louis at all. They were amazing. They called me on Friday, Saturday, Sunday, negative for all 3 viruses, and something was growing, and we were going to have to wait for the electron microscopy to further characterize the virus. That same day, I called up the CDC. I tried to explain that I thought there might be a link, and I was cut off in mid-sentence by the head of biosafety for the vector-borne disease laboratory in Fort Collins, who told me I was just dealing with, quote unquote, some veterinary thing, and that there was no possible relationship between the bird deaths and the people dying in New York City, period. Would not entertain any questions, would not consider testing my samples. But then I said, well, wait a minute. What do I tell my colleague? He suffered an accidental needle stick exposure this morning when he was euthanizing 2 neurologic flamingos. I've seen what whatever this is, can do to a brain. This guy has 3 children. What do I say to him? And without skipping a beat, the CDC official told me, no treatment, no cure, say a prayer and hope for the best. And then click, he literally hung up on me. This continued for the next 3 weeks, and CDC continued to refuse to admit that there might be a link between the bird deaths and the people dying. By this time, I had barrels and barrels of dead birds at the zoo. The curator and the director and the veterinarians were going crazy, and I had additional human exposures. So in a light bulb finally went off, and I was like, okay, CDC won't test my samples. I need a place with biosecurity. It is a flavivirus. We need at least biological safety level 3 to work on this virus, because we know flaviviruses kill people. I need a place with every reagent known to every dangerous virus known to man, and I need a place with a can-do attitude. And I realized I'll call the Army. And I picked up the phone and I called up the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute in Infectious Diseases at Fort Detrick. And when I said to them, it's something new to veterinary medicine, I think it's the same thing killing people in New York City, and no one will test my samples. The response I got from the chief of virology at Fort Detrick was, send us those samples on dry ice tonight. 48 hours later, West Nile virus was announced, and but we're left with a question. This had been missed for 2.5 months because of jurisdictional boundaries, because of a refusal to engage with the veterinary sector. And if this was a dress rehearsal for novel zoonotic threats, we haven't performed very well. Unfortunately, we are still following the same playbook. And in the US, personally, I think people in the European Union have done a far better job than we have. But my government has continued to take a myopic view to this, and they have focused solely on the human aspect of this and have ignored the animal component of emerging pandemic threats. I was honored to be asked to join the Red Dawn breaking team, which, as you heard, was pulled together to advise the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response of the United States. And I was I was thrilled to be asked, but I quickly became alarmed when I realized I looked at all the agencies listed in the email addresses of all these people on this team, and found to my horror that I was the only veterinarian involved. USDA was not involved. USGS, or our wildlife agency, was not involved. And so I pointed out, as the only veterinarian, I'm like, guys, I know you're flipping out about a possible human pandemic, but not for nothing. I hope you're aware that chickens and pigs die of many coronaviruses, and we happen to have two huge industries in the US, the swine industry and the poultry industry. Is anyone doing transmission studies on agricultural species? We need to know if this is a threat. Then I pointed out that the Chinese officials had said that any dog or cat exposed to a person with COVID-19 would have to go into quarantine, and told them, we've also been discussing for 21 years the fact that dogs and cats, zoo animals, local non-game wildlife are not under the jurisdiction of any federal agency and therefore are not under surveillance. What are we going to do if this pops up in dogs and cats and you have no legal or sociological framework to deal with this threat? And I begged for $300,000 to start transmission studies to answer the question, can these animals be infected? And more importantly, do they shed sufficient virus to infect human beings? We categorically needed an answer to those questions, but they refused to fund the studies. Then all of a sudden, dogs and cats are popping up positive, and the lions and tigers at the Bronx Zoo broke with COVID-19. In utter frustration, in the lack of my government's willingness to test for this or fund studies, I published a paper laying out all the studies that should have been done in companion animals and livestock following recognition of SARS-CoV-2 COVID-19. What animal species can be infected? What are the likely sources of infection? What is the transmissibility between these animals and other species and humans? Do we have the diagnostic tests we need? And but that went nowhere. So after several months, I have arrived at the conclusion that Ronald Reagan was right. The most frightening words in the English language are "I'm from the government and I'm here to help," at least in the United States, not saying anything about Ireland. And we clearly need to change our national emblem from that of the bald eagle to that of an ostrich, because they truly have just buried their heads in the sand. Now we're dealing with SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19 in mink. And it's been in the Netherlands, it's been in Denmark, it's been in Spain, it just keeps popping up all over the place. And the question is, we do know that this virus probably entered the mink population from people, but it has now jumped back into people and caused mutations. So what everyone in positions of power are flipping out about is those mutations decrease a person's ability to mount an immunologic response, which puts into question whether any of the vaccines that have been developed will work. And the really frightening thing is, in spite of enhanced biosecurity, early warning surveillance, doing everything we had at our arsenal of responding to this, we still haven't been able to slow this down, and we really don't know where this is going to go. And when it popped up in the US, a state vet said, well, at least we can cull mink because they're fur animals, not food animals. But what are we going to do when it pops up in food animals? Well, the answer to that is actually it already has. We saw that with Nipah virus in Malaysia, and it resulted in human deaths and culling of massive numbers of pigs. So, and now the OIE, what are we talking about now? How many months are we down the road? 10 months later, now they've come out with guidance on those people working with farmed animals. And I'm sorry, but this is just too slow. This is not the way to, it should not have taken 10 months for someone to say, it's popped up in dogs and cats and lions and tigers and now in mink. Maybe we need to take off the blinders and start looking across the board at animals and figure out which animals are susceptible and which animals might serve as reservoirs for this serious public health threat. I served as a scientific advisor for the film Contagion in 2011. And in that film, if you haven't watched it, you should. It really was prescient. We're seeing this unravel, we're seeing the exact same thing with COVID-19. But I think many people miss the importance of the message of the last 5 minutes of the film. And that was, you see forests being cut down. You see bats leaving their habitat that's been destroyed and finding other trees on a pig farm with fruit trees. The pigs ate and pooped and peed on the fruit. It falls to the ground where it's eaten by pigs. The next thing we know, a chef is cutting pork chops and he simply wipes his hands, his bloody hands, on his apron and shakes Gwyneth Paltrow's hand. And that is the beginning of a worldwide pandemic. Yes, the agricultural sector is going to be scrutinized. And I think we do need to look at what can we do on our end to decrease spillover of these viruses coming from animals. And I think we need to start thinking like a virus. We need to stop thinking as, I work with wildlife, I work with humans, I work with livestock. We need to pull back and take a 40,000-foot view. And when you do that, all these man-made boundaries between peoples, animals, and the environment blur. And that is a starting point for One Health, just to recognize it's all a continuum, it's all one. And I would ask you as farmers to remember that you are our front line of defense against not only endemic diseases, but emerging zoonotic threats. And in the US, in the wake of our terrorist attacks, Homeland Security launched a slogan saying, if you see something, say something. And please, I implore you to take that to heart and apply that to just emerging threats, whether they have anything to do with being Mother Nature or something intentional. Clearly, the old bromide they used to teach physicians in medical school was, when you hear hoofbeats in the distance, think horses, not zebras. Thinking if you see something unusual, think of the common diseases, don't think of these weird diagnoses. That is a mindset none of us can afford to adopt any longer. We all need to be looking for the zebras and looking for the unknown. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tracey, for a very thought-provoking presentation. A few, I suppose, we all need to expect the unexpected. I think certainly as vets, we don't always keep the exotic diseases at the back of our minds, but I think that's a good message, or that's a good reminder for us. Just